He led a nation through its darkest hour, but could never escape the darkness within himself. To the world, Winston Churchill was the voice of defiance, unyielding, unbreakable, almost mythological in his resolve. A man who stood against the storm when everything else collapsed. His words didn't just inspire a country, they saved it. But behind the speeches that echoed through history, there was silence. A silence filled with doubt. With fear. With something far more personal than war. Because long before the bombs fell over London, the battle had already begun inside him. They called it his black dog, a darkness that followed him relentlessly. Not during failure, but during triumph. Not when he was weak, but when he was at his strongest. And that is the contradiction history rarely confronts. The man who symbolized courage was quietly at war with despair. The deeper truth is this: Churchill didn't just fight to save Britain. He fought because he had to. Because stopping meant facing something far more terrifying than any enemy. And by the time the world celebrated his victory, the cost had already been paid in ways no one could see. Before the world ever heard his voice. Before history carved his name into stone. Winston Churchill was just a boy trying to be seen. Not loved, seen. He was born into power, into the aristocratic world of late Victorian Britain. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a rising political star, brilliant, charismatic, and dangerously unpredictable. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was dazzling, magnetic, and distant. To the outside world, it looked like privilege. But inside the walls of that household, there was absence. Emotional absence. Affection withheld like a currency he could never earn. His father was not a man who nurtured, he judged. Coldly. Sharply. Publicly. Young Winston grew up under the weight of a single, silent question. Why am I not enough? Letters from his father weren't filled with encouragement, but disappointment. Criticism. A constant reminder that he was failing to live up to expectations he barely understood. Where another child might have been guided, Churchill was measured, and always found lacking. Psychologically, this is where the fracture begins. Because a child who is not validated does not stop needing validation. He simply learns to chase it differently. Churchill didn't become resilient in spite of this environment. He became driven by it. The absence of approval didn't weaken him. It created a hunger. A dangerous one. School only deepened the wound. At Harrow School, Churchill was not exceptional. Not at first. He struggled academically, particularly in subjects that demanded rigid discipline. Latin, mathematics, areas where precision mattered more than personality. But there was something else happening beneath the surface. He wasn't just failing subjects. He was failing expectations. And every failure reinforced the same internal narrative. You are not enough. Not yet. Yet there was one place where something shifted. Language. Words. While he struggled in structured academia, Churchill found an almost instinctive connection to the rhythm of English. He memorized poetry. He absorbed speeches. He began to understand something profound. Words could command attention, even when you felt invisible. This wasn't just a skill. It was compensation. A psychological adaptation. If he couldn't earn love, he would demand attention. If he couldn't be approved, he would be undeniable. But the deeper conflict was already forming. Because Churchill wasn't just chasing success. He was running from something. His emotional world was unstable, oscillating between bursts of confidence and heavy periods of gloom. Long before the pressures of leadership, before the weight of war, he was already experiencing what he would later describe as the black dog. This wasn't poetic language. It was a recognition. A naming of something that lingered beneath his ambition. A shadow that never quite left. Modern psychological analysis would likely point to cycles of depression, possibly exacerbated by his upbringing, his constant exposure to criticism, and the emotional neglect that shaped his formative years. But Churchill didn't have that framework. He didn't analyze it. He fought it. There's an irony here that history often overlooks. The boy who felt powerless became obsessed with power. Not just political power, but control. Control over narrative. Over perception. Over how the world saw him. Because if he could control that, he could finally silence the voice that told him he was inadequate. And so, even in his early years, a pattern began to emerge. He would take risks others avoided. He would push himself into danger. He would seek out moments where he could prove, publicly, undeniably, that he mattered. This is not confidence. This is compensation. After Harrow, Churchill entered the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. Not because he was destined for it, but because it was one of the few paths still open to him. Even there, success didn't come easily. He failed the entrance exam, twice. Twice. For most, that would have been a sign to step back. For Churchill, it became something else entirely. Proof that he needed to push harder. On his third attempt, he succeeded. But what matters isn't the success. It's the pattern. Failure didn't discourage him. It activated him. Because every obstacle was no longer just a challenge. It was personal. At Sandhurst, something finally aligned. Unlike traditional academic environments, the military rewarded boldness, initiative, presence. And Churchill had those in abundance. He began to excel, not necessarily because he was the most disciplined, but because he understood something others didn't. Visibility mattered. Courage, when seen, became reputation. And reputation became identity. For the first time, he wasn't just the boy who disappointed his father. He was becoming someone noticeable. But even here, the internal conflict never disappeared. Because external validation is never enough to heal internal wounds. It only masks them. And Churchill's ambition began to evolve into something more intense, almost obsessive. He didn't just want to succeed. He wanted to be remembered. Immortalized. Because somewhere deep inside, there was still that boy. Trying to prove something to a man who would never truly see him. And then came another turning point. The death of his father. Lord Randolph Churchill died when Winston was just 20 years old. Young. Sudden. Final. For most, this would bring grief. For Churchill, it brought something far more complicated. Unresolved tension. Because the approval he had been chasing was now impossible. There would be no moment of recognition. No final validation. No, I'm proud of you. Just silence. Permanent silence. Psychologically, this changes everything. Because when closure is denied, the pursuit doesn't end. It intensifies. Churchill didn't stop trying to prove himself. He simply changed the audience. If his father couldn't see him, then the world would. And this is where the foundation of his future was truly built. Not on confidence. Not on stability. But on a deep, unresolved need. To matter. To be seen. To be undeniable. At any cost. Even if that cost would one day consume him. By the time the world began to notice him, Winston Churchill had already decided something irreversible. Ordinary life was not an option. Not because he couldn't live it, but because he refused to be forgotten. This is where ambition stops being healthy and starts becoming necessary. His early military career wasn't driven by duty alone. It was calculated, strategic, almost theatrical. Churchill didn't just want to serve, he wanted to be seen serving. He placed himself deliberately in the path of danger, traveling to conflict zones not just as a soldier, but as a war correspondent. Cuba, India, Sudan, South Africa. Each destination was not just a battlefield. It was a stage. And Churchill understood something most men of his time did not. History does not remember the quiet. It remembers the visible. In Battle of Omdurman, he charged with the cavalry, an act that would later be romanticized as bravery. But psychologically, it was something deeper. It was proof. Proof that he was not weak. Not invisible. Not the disappointing son his father believed him to be. Every risk he took was a message. And the audience was no longer just Britain. It was himself. But then came the moment that changed everything. Not because of victory, but because of failure. During the Second Boer War, Churchill was captured. Imprisoned. Humiliated. For a man constructing an identity around courage and visibility, this was catastrophic. Because failure, when it's public, doesn't just hurt. It threatens the story you're trying to tell about yourself. And yet, this is where Churchill reveals his most defining psychological trait. He didn't accept the narrative. He rewrote it. His escape from a Boer prison camp became legend. He scaled walls. Evaded capture. Traveled hundreds of miles through enemy territory. It was reckless. Almost irrational. But it worked. And when he returned to Britain, he wasn't seen as a prisoner. He was seen as a hero. This moment is critical. Because it reinforced a dangerous belief. Reality doesn't matter. Perception does. Churchill learned that even failure could be transformed, if you controlled the story. And from that point forward, he never stopped trying to control it. He entered politics soon after. Not cautiously. Not gradually. But with the same intensity he brought to war. Parliament wasn't just a place of governance. It was another stage. Another battlefield. His early years in politics were unstable. He switched parties, from conservative to liberal, something that made him deeply unpopular among traditionalists. To many, it looked like opportunism. To Churchill, it was adaptation. He wasn't loyal to ideology. He was loyal to momentum. Because stopping meant risking irrelevance. And irrelevance was the one thing he could not tolerate. But here's the deeper psychological tension. Churchill's greatest strength, his willingness to act decisively, boldly, unpredictably, was also his greatest weakness. Because impulsive ambition doesn't always lead to control. Sometimes, it leads to chaos. And chaos arrived. In the form of one of the most controversial decisions of his early career. The Gallipoli Campaign. At the time, Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, a position of immense power. The war was stagnant. Brutal. Directionless. Churchill wanted a breakthrough. Something bold. Something decisive. Something that would change the course of the war, and solidify his legacy. The plan was simple in theory. Attack the Ottoman Empire through the Dardanelles. Open a new front. Shift the balance. But in execution, it was a disaster. Poor planning. Underestimation of the enemy. Logistical failures. Thousands of soldiers died. For nothing. And for the first time in his adult life, Churchill couldn't rewrite the narrative. Because the scale of the failure was too large. Too visible. Too real. He was blamed. Publicly. Relentlessly. Stripped of power. Forced to resign. This wasn't just a political defeat. It was a psychological collapse. Because Churchill's identity was built on one core belief. That bold action leads to success. That risk creates greatness. That he was different. Gallipoli shattered that illusion. It exposed something far more dangerous. That his instincts, his very nature, could lead to destruction. Not just for himself, but for thousands of others. And this is where the black dog returned. Not as a shadow, but as something heavier. More suffocating. He withdrew. Isolated himself. Painted obsessively, landscapes, scenes, anything to escape the weight of failure. This wasn't leisure. It was survival. A way to quiet the noise in his mind. But even in isolation, the pattern remained. He didn't reflect deeply on his mistakes. He endured them. Waited. Prepared for the next opportunity to prove himself again. Because Churchill didn't know how to exist without purpose. And purpose, for him, was always tied to conflict. To struggle. To something that demanded everything from him. There's a paradox here that defines his rise. The more he failed, the more he needed to succeed. The more he was rejected, the more he needed to be recognized. And so, instead of retreating permanently, he returned. Slowly. Carefully. But with the same underlying drive. By the 1930s, Churchill was no longer at the center of power. In fact, he was considered politically irrelevant. Outdated. Too aggressive. Too unpredictable. A relic of a past era. But Churchill saw something others refused to see. A threat rising in Europe. A danger that was being ignored. While others sought peace. He prepared for war. This wasn't just foresight. It was instinct. Because Churchill understood something most leaders didn't. Conflict was not an interruption of history. It was history. And when the moment came, when the world began to collapse again, Churchill would be ready. Not because he was flawless, but because he had spent his entire life preparing for a fight. Both outside and within. When the moment finally arrived, it didn't feel like opportunity. It felt like inevitability. By 1940, Europe was collapsing under the weight of Adolf Hitler's expansion. Nation after nation had fallen. Fear wasn't spreading, it had already taken hold. And Britain? Britain was next. To many, Winston Churchill was the wrong choice. Too volatile. Too emotional. Too unpredictable. A man with a history of failure, now handed the fate of a nation. It didn't make sense. Unless you understood one thing. Churchill had been preparing for this his entire life. Because this wasn't just war. This was meaning. When he became Prime Minister, there was no celebration behind closed doors. No relief. Only pressure. Crushing, absolute pressure. Because for Churchill, this wasn't about leading Britain. It was about proving, once and for all, that he was who he believed himself to be. His speeches became legend. We shall fight on the beaches. But those words weren't just for the public. They were for himself. Each sentence, a reinforcement. Each phrase, a shield against doubt. Because behind the certainty he projected, there was still uncertainty. Psychologically, this is where the illusion begins. The world saw a man of unwavering confidence. But internally, Churchill was balancing on a razor's edge. He thrived in crisis. Because crisis simplified everything. There were no complex social dynamics to navigate. No subtle expectations. Only one clear objective. Survive. Win. And in that environment, Churchill was extraordinary. During the Battle of Britain, as bombs fell over London, he didn't retreat into safety. He moved toward the destruction. Visited bomb sites. Walked through rubble. Stood among civilians who had lost everything. This wasn't just leadership. It was psychological alignment. For the first time in his life, his internal chaos matched the external world. And that made him powerful. But power comes with distortion. Because when a man is rewarded for his intensity, he begins to believe that intensity is always right. Churchill's relationship with his allies reveals this clearly. With Franklin D. Roosevelt, there was mutual respect, but also dependency. Churchill needed Roosevelt. Needed American support. Resources. Validation. Their correspondence wasn't just strategic. It was emotional. Churchill admired him, but also relied on him in a way that bordered on vulnerability. And then there was Joseph Stalin. A man Churchill fundamentally distrusted. A dictator whose values clashed entirely with his own. And yet, they were allies. This is where the contradiction deepens. Churchill, the defender of democracy, was forced to cooperate with tyranny. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. And psychologically, this creates tension. Because when your identity is built on moral clarity, compromise feels like betrayal. Even when it's necessary. But Churchill didn't have the luxury of moral purity. He had a war to win. And win he did. By 1945, World War II in Europe was ending. Hitler was defeated. Britain had survived. Churchill had achieved what once seemed impossible. This should have been his moment. The culmination of everything he had worked for. The ultimate validation. But here's the truth no one talks about. Victory didn't bring peace. Because Churchill's identity wasn't built for peace. It was built for struggle. When the war ended, the purpose that had sustained him disappeared. And without purpose, the internal conflict returned. Stronger than before. Even at the height of his power, cracks were forming. His drinking increased. His mood swings became more pronounced. Periods of intense productivity followed by deep withdrawal. The black dog was no longer hiding. It was present. Persistent. Waiting. And then came the moment that shattered the illusion completely. In 1945, after leading Britain to victory, Churchill lost the general election. Think about that. The man who saved the nation was rejected by it. This wasn't just political. It was deeply personal. Because Churchill had tied his identity to one belief. That he was necessary. And suddenly, he wasn't. The public didn't see him as the leader of the future. They saw him as the man of war. And the war was over. This is the cruelest irony of power. The very qualities that make you indispensable in one moment can make you irrelevant in the next. For Churchill, this was more than a transition. It was an emotional rupture. Because without crisis, without conflict, without a stage large enough for his intensity, he was forced to confront something he had spent his entire life avoiding. Himself. And what he found there was not victory, but emptiness. Victory should have been the end of the struggle. For most men, it would have been. But for Winston Churchill, victory was where the real collapse began. Because when the war ended, so did the illusion that had been holding him together. The loss of the 1945 election wasn't just a political defeat. It was a psychological dislocation. A sudden, violent separation from purpose. For years, Churchill had existed in a state of total clarity. Every decision, every word, every sleepless night had meaning. Now, there was silence. And silence, for a man like Churchill, was dangerous. Without crisis, the black dog didn't just return. It settled in. More persistent. More suffocating. Not as a passing shadow, but as a constant presence. Observers at the time noticed the shifts. The energy that once fueled his speeches began to fracture. Moments of brilliance still appeared, but they were inconsistent, unpredictable. Behind closed doors, he became more withdrawn. More volatile. Psychologically, this is what happens when identity is fused with function. When the function disappears, the identity collapses with it. Churchill tried to recreate purpose. He returned to writing, painting, speaking. But none of it carried the same weight. Because none of it demanded everything from him. And Churchill needed that demand. Needed the pressure. Needed the feeling that something catastrophic would happen if he failed. Without it, he felt unnecessary. There is a particular cruelty in this stage of life. Because externally, Churchill was still admired, still respected, still celebrated as the man who had led Britain through its darkest hour. But admiration is not the same as need. And Churchill didn't want to be admired. He wanted to be essential. In 1951, he returned to power. Prime Minister once again. On the surface, it looked like redemption. A second act. Proof that he still mattered. But internally, something had changed. Age had caught up with him. So had exhaustion. Years of relentless pressure had taken their toll, not just physically, but psychologically. He suffered strokes. His health declined. His energy became inconsistent. And yet, he refused to let go. This is where the obsession reveals its final form. Because Churchill wasn't just holding on to power. He was holding on to identity. Letting go of leadership would mean confronting a truth he had spent his entire life avoiding. That he was no longer the man he believed himself to be. So he stayed. Longer than he should have. Decisions became slower. Judgment less sharp. The clarity that once defined him began to fade. But no one wanted to say it. Because Churchill wasn't just a leader. He was a symbol. And symbols are dangerous to challenge. There's a quiet tragedy in this phase. Not dramatic. Not explosive. But deeply human. A man who once commanded history. Now struggling to command himself. His relationships began to reflect this decline. With his wife, Clementine Churchill, there was loyalty, but also distance. She had always been a stabilizing force. A quiet counterbalance to his intensity. But even she couldn't fully reach him. Because Churchill didn't just isolate physically. He isolated emotionally. The deeper he felt his control slipping, the more he retreated inward. And this is the final psychological contradiction. The man who rallied a nation could not rally himself. By the time he finally resigned in 1955, it wasn't a decision of strength. It was inevitability. The body had weakened. The mind had slowed. But more importantly, the purpose was gone. And without purpose, Churchill was left alone with the one thing he had spent his entire life outrunning. Himself. There's no battlefield more unforgiving than that. After the final applause faded. After the last title was relinquished. After the machinery of power moved on without him. Winston Churchill was left with something he had never truly faced before. A life without urgency. For decades, his existence had been defined by necessity. Every morning had a purpose. Every decision carried weight. Every moment demanded something from him. Now, nothing did. And for most, that might sound like peace. But for Churchill, it felt like erasure. Because the silence he had avoided his entire life was no longer optional. It was constant. He spent his later years at Chartwell, surrounded by the physical evidence of a life once lived at full intensity. Paintings. Books. Awards. Letters from world leaders. Artifacts of significance. Proof that he had mattered. But objects cannot replace purpose. They only remind you of what's gone. There is something deeply psychological about this phase of life, especially for individuals whose identity is built on external impact. When the world no longer demands you, you begin to question whether you ever truly existed beyond it. Churchill filled his days with routines. Writing his memoirs. Painting landscapes. Walking the grounds. From the outside, it appeared peaceful. Even dignified. But internally, the conflict remained unresolved. Because Churchill was not a man designed for stillness. Stillness forced reflection. And reflection brought him back to the same unanswered questions that had followed him since childhood. Was it enough? Did it mean what I thought it did? And if the world no longer needs me, who am I? His physical decline only intensified these questions. Strokes had weakened him. His speech slowed. His once commanding presence became fragile. This is the cruel inversion of power. The man who once shaped history, now dependent on others for the simplest things. And yet, there was something almost symbolic in this transformation. Because for the first time in his life, Churchill could not fight his way forward. There were no speeches that could reverse time. No strategies that could restore his strength. No audience left to convince. Only acceptance. But acceptance is not something Churchill had ever mastered. His relationship with Clementine Churchill became even more significant during this time. She remained by his side, not as a political partner, but as something far more important. A witness. She had seen the rise. The power. The obsession. The collapse. And now, she saw what remained. There is a quiet intimacy in being witnessed at your lowest point. Not as a leader. Not as a symbol. But as a human being. And perhaps, this was the one form of validation Churchill had never fully allowed himself to receive. Not from the public. Not from history. But from someone who knew him completely. Still, the internal tension never fully disappeared. Because even in decline, the mind remembers what it once was. Moments of clarity would return. Brief flashes of the man he used to be. Sharp. Witty. Insightful. Then they would fade. And each time they faded, the contrast became more painful. Churchill lived long enough to witness his own transformation into legend. Statues. Honors. Recognition. The world had decided what he represented. But there's a difference between being remembered and feeling understood. Because the world remembered the speeches, the victories, the strength. But it did not feel the weight of his doubt. The persistence of his black dog. The lifelong need to prove something that could never quite be proven. And so, in the final years of his life, Churchill existed in a space between two realities. The myth the world celebrated. And the man who had lived it. One was powerful. The other was tired. And in that space, there is a kind of loneliness that no amount of legacy can fill. When Winston Churchill died in 1965, the world didn't just mourn a man. It mourned a symbol. State funerals. Global tributes. Leaders from across nations gathering to honor the figure who had once stood between collapse and survival. History, as it often does, simplified him. It carved his story into something clean. Something understandable. A hero. A savior. A voice of courage. But legacy is not truth. It is interpretation. Because what remains after a life like Churchill's is not just what he did. It's what it cost him to do it. The illusion was powerful. A man of unshakable confidence. A leader who never doubted. A force of pure will against impossible odds. The reality was far more complex. A man driven not just by vision, but by a lifelong need to prove his worth. A man whose greatest strength, his relentless intensity, was born from a wound that never fully healed. And the cost? It wasn't just political. It wasn't just physical. It was internal. Because Churchill didn't simply fight external enemies. He fought himself. For decades. The black dog he spoke of so openly wasn't a poetic metaphor. It was a constant presence. A reminder that even in moments of triumph, something inside him remained unsettled. And here lies the deepest irony of his life. The man who gave millions the strength to endure struggled to give himself the same peace. History celebrates outcomes. But psychology reveals process. And the process, in Churchill's case, was not one of steady greatness. It was one of oscillation. Between confidence and doubt. Between brilliance and recklessness. between purpose and emptiness. He did not become extraordinary because he was whole. He became extraordinary because he was fractured. That fracture drove him, pushed him, refused to let him settle. But it also ensured something else: that no achievement would ever feel complete. There is a quiet lesson hidden in his life, one that history rarely speaks aloud. That success, when built on unresolved need, does not resolve the need. It amplifies it. Churchill reached the pinnacle of influence. He shaped the course of the 20th century. He became immortal in the pages of history. And yet, the internal question remained unanswered. Was it enough? Perhaps that is the final truth of power. That it promises resolution, but rarely delivers it. And so what remains is not just a legacy of leadership, but a reflection of something far more human. That even the strongest figures in history carry invisible battles. Battles that no victory can fully end. Churchill once stood before a nation and gave them the words to survive. But in the quiet moments of his own life, he was still searching for his own. And maybe that is why his story endures. Not because he was perfect, but because he wasn't. Because behind the myth was a man trying, relentlessly, to outrun a silence that never stopped following him. And in the end, it didn't. If this story made you see power differently, stay with the series, because some of the greatest empires ever built were also the loneliest.